The Roman Empire had endured centuries of triumph and conquest, its legions sweeping across the lands from Britannia to the sands of Mesopotamia. It was a realm built on discipline, strategy, and the rigid hierarchy of its military machine. Yet beneath the grandeur of marble columns and the might of well-drilled cohorts, there were fissures that threatened its stability. By the late 4th century, the empire was stretched thin, its borders besieged by restless tribes, its emperors weighed down by internal strife and the constant demands of survival. In this precarious era, the Goths, fierce and determined, found themselves pushed against the Danube, seeking refuge from the relentless Huns pressing from the east. Their leaders, including the shrewd Fritigern, saw opportunity in desperation, a chance to secure lands and resources in a world that seemed increasingly hostile. Rome, confident in its enduring military supremacy, would soon learn how fragile that confidence could be. Emperor Valens, ruling the eastern provinces, was a man both proud and ambitious. Though he had inherited a realm under pressure, he sought to assert his authority and protect the honor of Rome. Reports of Gothic crossings into Thrace and their plundering of Roman lands stirred alarm, yet Valens underestimated the resolve and strategic cunning of his adversaries. Unlike the disciplined legions of Rome, the Goths were mobile, adaptive, and intimately familiar with the terrain they inhabited. They understood that survival demanded more than courage. It required cunning, patience, and the ability to strike where the enemy least expected it. As the Danube swelled with refugees and warriors alike, a storm brewed on the horizon, one that would mark the empire's darkest hour. The Roman march into Thrace was initially calculated, methodical. Valens believed that a direct engagement would crush the Goths before they could consolidate their position. His legions, a mixture of seasoned veterans and newer recruits, moved with confidence, their standards held high, their armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. Yet Rome's might was a double-edged sword. Its size and rigidity made it vulnerable to tactics it could not predict. Scouts reported scattered Gothic settlements and uncoordinated skirmishes, reinforcing the emperor's belief in a swift victory. What Valens failed to grasp was that appearances were deceiving. The Goths, though numerically smaller, were poised, patient, and resolute, biding their time in the dense forests and rolling hills that characterized the Thracian landscape. The day of the battle dawned with a deceptive calm. Mist hung low over the fields near Adrianople, softening the edges of the terrain and shrouding the movements of men and horse alike. Roman banners fluttered in the breeze as the legions arrayed themselves, armor clinking, spears thrust forward in anticipation. Fritigern's forces, meanwhile, observed from the woodlands, concealed and silent. Among them, mounted archers, infantry with axes, and seasoned warriors waited for the precise moment to unleash chaos. It was a clash of worlds, the disciplined, rigid formations of Rome against the fluid, adaptive strategies of the Goths, whose understanding of terrain and timing would prove fatal. When the battle erupted, it was sudden and merciless. Arrows darkened the sky, striking the Roman lines with unerring precision. The Goths surged forth from cover, their cavalry flanking and harrying, their infantry cutting swaths through formations that once seemed invincible. Chaos spread through the ranks as disciplined cohesion dissolved under relentless assault. Valens, desperate to regain control, pressed forward into the fray. But the terrain and the tactics of his opponents rendered his efforts futile. The Roman cavalry found itself unable to maneuver, while infantry units, encumbered by armor and heavy shields, became easy targets for the agile Gothic fighters. In that moment, the mightiest military machine of the ancient world began to crumble, its order devoured by a force it had failed to anticipate. Amidst the carnage, stories of individual heroism and tragedy unfolded. Roman soldiers, trained for decades in the art of war, fought with desperate valor, forming tight shields and spears to repel the Gothic onslaught. Yet the flood of enemies was unending. waves of warriors pressing from every direction, exploiting every weakness. Horses fell, spears broke, and the cries of the wounded echoed across the battlefield. Fritigern, orchestrating his forces with unerring judgment, pressed the advantage relentlessly. It was not mere luck or chance. It was strategy honed by years of survival and the knowledge that a single decisive blow could change the course of history. The death of Valens marked the ultimate collapse of Roman command on that day. Whether slain in combat or overwhelmed by flames and confusion, his absence left the legions leaderless, a critical blow from which they could not recover. The Goths, sensing victory, pressed their advantage, their archers encircling remaining pockets of resistance, their infantry striking with lethal precision. Thousands of Romans perished, the battlefield strewn with the fallen, their armor glinting dully in the light of a waning sun. This was a massacre on a scale that Rome had rarely faced, a humiliation that reverberated across the empire and beyond, shattering the myth of invincibility that had long surrounded the legions. In the aftermath, the survivors scattered, and the Gothic forces consolidated their position in Thrace. Adrianople became a symbol of Roman vulnerability, a cautionary tale of hubris and underestimation. The empire, once thought invulnerable, was forced to confront the reality that strength alone could not guarantee victory. Political consequences rippled through Constantinople and beyond, as generals and senators wrestled with the implications of such a catastrophic loss. Diplomacy, military reform, and the very understanding of Rome's relationship with the barbarian tribes were all called into question, setting the stage for decades of negotiation, conflict, and uneasy coexistence along the empire's northern borders. The legacy of Adrianople extends far beyond the battlefield itself. It demonstrated the evolving nature of warfare, highlighting the lethal effectiveness of cavalry and mobile forces against rigid infantry formations. It showcased the dangers of overconfidence and the consequences of ignoring intelligence and local knowledge. And it reminded the Roman world that the barbarians it had long dismissed as inferior could, under the right circumstances, inflict unprecedented devastation. Adrianople was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a moment when the old certainties of Rome were irrevocably challenged, and a new era of uncertainty and adaptation began to unfold. Even as historians and storytellers reflect upon the events of 378 CE, the human stories persist, tales of valor, desperation, leadership, and cunning. The Goths emerged not merely as destroyers but as survivors, opportunists and strategists whose actions reshaped the Roman East. The legions, though battered and humiliated, endured, learning painful lessons that would echo through the corridors of power for generations. In contemplating Adrianople, one glimpses the fragile nature of empires, the relentless march of history, and the eternal interplay between order and chaos, discipline and cunning, the expected and the unforeseen. The blood-soaked fields of Adrianople lie silent now, yet their story resonates through the ages. They remind us that even the mightiest can fall, that strategy and adaptability can overturn centuries of perceived supremacy, and that history often pivots on moments of audacious courage and catastrophic miscalculation. As the sun sets over Thrace, leaving the echoes of that fateful day in its wake, we are left to ponder the lessons of Adrianople, the shadows it cast over Rome, and the dawn of a new chapter in a world forever changed by the clash between empire and barbarians. Amid the smoke and chaos of Adrianople, the individual stories of courage and desperation stood in stark contrast to the scale of the catastrophe. Roman centurions, their armor dented and bloodied, struggled to maintain formations, shouting commands into the din as arrows whistled past and axes cleaved shields. Men who had trained for years, schooled in discipline and obedience, found themselves pressed to their limits by foes who fought with a fluidity and unpredictability that defied Roman doctrine. Cavalry charges struck like thunderclaps, while Gothic infantry, moving with uncanny coordination, exploited the slightest weakness in the Roman lines. Each engagement was a microcosm of the larger conflict, a moment where skill and fate intertwined, and where individual valor could not always stem the tide of disaster. Fritigern's brilliance as a commander was revealed in the orchestration of the Gothic forces. He understood that Rome relied heavily on rigid formations and predictable movements, and he manipulated the battlefield to maximize chaos. Ambushes from concealed positions disrupted communication, while mounted archers harried the flanks, preventing the Roman cavalry from forming cohesive counterattacks. The dense forests and undulating hills of Thrace became allies to the Goths, transforming the terrain into a weapon. Each maneuver was calculated, timed with patience, a deadly choreography that unfolded with precision. To the Romans, it must have seemed as though the world itself had turned against them. The earth concealing enemies at every turn, the sky raining death from above. The psychological toll on the Roman soldiers was immense. Men who had marched confidently into Thrace now faced a relentless, invisible enemy, one whose numbers and tactics seemed to grow as the battle progressed. Fear and exhaustion spread as rapidly as the Gothic assault, and discipline, the hallmark of Roman military power, began to crumble. Cohorts became isolated, units were cut off from reinforcements, and the tightly ordered legions dissolved into fragments. The battlefield became a swirling chaos, with cries of anguish and the clash of steel echoing across the landscape. Even the most experienced veterans struggled to maintain cohesion, their training strained to the breaking point. Valens, the emperor, was fully aware that the battle's outcome would define his legacy. He pressed forward with determination, seeking to rally his troops and seize control of the fight. Yet the dense terrain, the relentless Gothic attacks, and the sheer momentum of the ambush made his efforts increasingly futile. Reports from the front lines were sporadic and conflicting. Messengers found themselves trapped or cut down, leaving Valens in isolation amidst the chaos. Historians have debated whether he underestimated the Goths deliberately, or whether a fatal arrogance clouded his judgment. Either way, his absence from effective command sealed the fate of the Roman army. As the day wore on, the scale of the slaughter became evident. Roman soldiers fell by the thousands, their bodies littering the fields, their shields shattered, their standards toppled. Horses, panicked and wounded, trampled the fallen, adding to the horror. The Goths, though also suffering casualties, maintained cohesion and pressed their advantage with unrelenting resolve. Their victory was not merely tactical. It was a profound psychological blow to Rome, an event that undermined centuries of perceived military superiority. In the aftermath, the battlefield became a stark testament to the shifting balance of power, where the disciplined might of Rome had been humbled by adaptability, cunning, and determination. Yet the story of Adrianople does not end with death and destruction alone. Among the chaos, there were acts of extraordinary bravery and unexpected mercy. Accounts describe soldiers fighting to protect comrades, leaders sacrificing their own safety to rally fragmented units, and civilians caught in the crossfire seeking refuge amid the carnage. These human moments, though often overshadowed by the scale of the disaster, reveal the enduring spirit of those who faced impossible odds. They remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, courage and resilience persist, flickering like a fragile flame amid the shadows of calamity. The aftermath of Adrianople forced Rome to confront uncomfortable truths about its military and political structures. The empire could no longer rely solely on numerical strength or the rigidity of tradition. It had to adapt to the changing nature of warfare and diplomacy. Gothic victories emboldened other tribes along the empire's borders, setting off a chain reaction of unrest and rebellion. Roman leaders, both in the East and the West, faced the pressing need to reform recruitment, training, and strategy to prevent further disasters. Diplomacy with the Goths, once considered barbarian outsiders, became a matter of urgent necessity. Treaties, settlements, and negotiations reshaped the balance of power, reflecting a Rome that was resilient yet fundamentally transformed by the lessons of Adrianople. The mythological and symbolic dimensions of the battle also became intertwined with its historical reality. Roman chroniclers likened the catastrophe to the wrath of the gods, a punishment for pride and misjudgment. Gothic accounts celebrated triumph and survival, portraying the battle as a vindication of courage and cunning over the arrogance of empire. Stories of heroism, divine favor, and moral lessons proliferated, embedding Adrianople in the cultural memory of Europe as a turning point between the ancient world and the evolving medieval landscape. In these narratives, history and legend coalesced, shaping the way subsequent generations understood the fragility of power and the enduring impact of decisive moments. Adrianople's shadow stretched far beyond the battlefield, influencing politics, strategy, and culture across the Roman world. It forced the empire to adapt, to reconsider alliances, and to recognize the effectiveness of mobile, strategic forces against static, heavily armored legions. It also foreshadowed the long-term transformations that would eventually lead to the fall of the Western Roman Empire centuries later. The Gothic victory was not merely a tactical success, but a symbolic rupture, a reminder that even the mightiest empire was vulnerable to innovation, audacity, and the relentless forces of history. As the sun set over the fields near Adrianople, casting long shadows across the fallen, one could almost hear the echoes of the clash reverberating through time. The story of that fateful day, of Rome's hubris and the Goths' cunning, was etched into the collective memory of an empire and its people. It was a lesson in strategy, in courage, in the consequences of underestimating one's adversaries. Adrianople was more than a battle. It was a mirror reflecting the impermanence of power and the inevitability of change, a moment when the course of history pivoted under the weight of human ambition, skill, and fate. The news of Valens' death and the annihilation of his eastern legions reached Constantinople like a thunderclap, shaking the foundations of the imperial court. Senators, generals, and administrators struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster. Panic mixed with disbelief as the reality sank in. The Roman Empire, long thought unassailable, had suffered a humiliation so profound that its reverberations would echo across generations. Emperor Gratian in the west immediately mobilized reinforcements, yet even as the legions prepared to march eastward, it was clear that Adrianople had changed the calculus of Roman power. The aura of invincibility that had long surrounded Rome's armies was shattered, replaced by a new understanding that survival required adaptation as much as courage. In the wake of Adrianople, the Gothic forces solidified their position in Thrace, occupying lands and establishing settlements within the very heart of the empire they had once been called barbarians to. This integration of Gothic populations into Roman territories was unprecedented and fraught with tension. It forced the empire to engage in a delicate balancing act, appeasing and managing these new subjects while shoring up defenses against future threats. Fritigern emerged not only as a victor on the battlefield, but as a political actor, negotiating with imperial authorities and leveraging his triumph to secure favorable terms for his people. The Goths' transition from external threat to semi-autonomous partners within Roman lands marked a profound transformation in the relationship between Rome and the barbarian tribes that would shape the centuries to come. Rome itself was compelled to rethink its military doctrine. The legions, once celebrated for their heavy infantry and tight formations, faced the hard truth that flexibility and mobility were equally vital. Cavalry units were expanded, scouting and intelligence became paramount, and commanders studied the tactics of the Goths with newfound seriousness. The lessons of Adrianople underscored the dangers of complacency and the consequences of underestimating opponents who fought not by tradition, but by cunning and opportunity. Military manuals and treatises began to reflect these insights, blending Roman discipline with lessons drawn from the very enemies who had shattered it. Politically, the battle forced the empire into a state of heightened vigilance. Emperors now had to contend with the dual pressures of internal administration and external threat, balancing diplomacy with displays of military power. The eastern provinces, once thought secure, became a crucible of negotiation and defense. Treaties with the Goths included land grants, provisions, and recognition of their leaders, a delicate compromise intended to prevent further uprisings while acknowledging the reality of Gothic strength. Yet these measures also sowed seeds of tension. Integrating foreign warriors into Roman structures created friction, cultural challenges, and the potential for future conflicts, foreshadowing the complex dynamics of empire and barbarian relations that would dominate the following centuries. The cultural impact of Adrianople cannot be understated. Chroniclers of the time imbued the event with moral and mythological significance, portraying the Goths as instruments of divine judgment against the arrogance of Rome. Stories circulated of omens and celestial signs, of prophetic warnings ignored by Valens, framing the battle as both historical and cosmic in its consequences. In Gothic lore, the victory at Adrianople became a symbol of ingenuity, courage, and resilience, a testament to a people who, though deemed outsiders, had leveraged strategy, timing, and daring to reshape the destiny of an empire. These narratives, blending fact and myth, would influence the memory of Adrianople for centuries, transforming it into a cautionary tale and a legend of heroism and tragedy alike. The psychological scars of the battle extended far beyond the military and political spheres. Roman citizens, once assured of their empire's invulnerability, now confronted the fragility of their civilization. Tales of Adrianople filtered through markets, forums, and villas, spreading fear and fascination. The image of the great legions falling to a coalition of so-called barbarians challenged the cultural identity of Rome itself. Yet from this shock emerged reflection and innovation. Military reforms, border fortifications, and strategic alliances became not just responses to immediate threats, but investments in a long-term vision of survival. The empire learned that endurance required adaptability, that power was not merely the weight of steel, but the agility of strategy and foresight. Adrianople also set a precedent for the role of barbarian groups within the empire. The Goths' victory demonstrated that external foes could be transformed into political stakeholders, military auxiliaries, and even cultural influencers. Over time, this dynamic contributed to a profound shift in the composition of Roman armies, which increasingly relied on federated troops from diverse backgrounds. The very notion of Roman identity evolved, encompassing not only the descendants of the founding citizens, but also those once considered outsiders, warriors who had proven their prowess on the battlefield and earned their place within the empire's structures. In reflecting on Adrianople, one sees a convergence of forces, strategic brilliance, miscalculation, courage, and fate that reshaped an empire. The battle stands as a testament to the fragility of even the mightiest powers and the enduring importance of adaptability in the face of unpredictable challenges. It reminds us that history is often forged in moments of crisis, where a single decision, a single clash, can reverberate across decades, altering the trajectory of civilizations. Adrianople was such a moment, a turning point that illuminated the limits of authority and the possibilities of ingenuity. The fields of Thrace, once soaked in blood and echoing with the cries of combatants, became silent witnesses to this pivotal transformation. Over time, nature reclaimed the land, and human memory preserved the stories of heroism and catastrophe. Yet the lessons of Adrianople remained vivid. studied by generals, chroniclers, and historians alike. They spoke of the dangers of underestimation, the power of strategic ingenuity, and the necessity of leadership that could adapt to circumstances beyond conventional wisdom. The battle was no longer merely a historical event. It became a mirror reflecting the eternal tension between order and chaos, power and vulnerability, ambition and prudence. As we look back on the Battle of Adrianople, we are reminded that history is shaped not only by armies and emperors, but by the choices, courage, and cunning of those who confront the challenges of their time. The Goths emerged from the forests as agents of change, their victory a testament to the unpredictable currents of history. Rome, battered yet enduring, learned lessons that would echo through its final centuries, shaping the evolution of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. Adrianople stands as both warning and inspiration, a story of ambition and audacity, of hubris and survival, and a chapter in the eternal saga of human conflict and resilience. Decades after the fields of Adrianople ran red, the memory of that day endured as a defining moment in the story of Rome and the barbarians it had long considered outsiders. The Gothic victory was more than a military triumph. It was a demonstration that empires, no matter how vast or disciplined, could falter when overconfident, unprepared, or unaware of the cunning of their opponents. In the centuries that followed, Adrianople would be studied by generals, feared by emperors, and recounted by storytellers as a warning that strength alone was never enough. It was a reminder that history is a living force, shaped as much by intelligence, adaptability, and timing as by sheer power. The Gothic settlement in Thrace marked the beginning of a profound transformation in the Eastern Empire. Their presence within Roman territories brought new customs, new military practices, and a new political dynamic. The once rigid boundaries between Roman and barbarian blurred, creating a complex tapestry of alliances, tensions, and mutual influence. Gothic warriors would serve in Roman armies, Gothic leaders would negotiate with emperors, and Gothic culture would leave an indelible mark on the lands they now called home. Adrianople had shattered the illusion of insurmountable Roman authority and revealed the potential of collaboration and conflict between worlds previously thought irreconcilable. For Rome, the lessons were painful but necessary. Military reforms reshaped the legions, emphasizing mobility, reconnaissance, and flexibility to counter forces that no longer adhered to predictable patterns of engagement. Leadership was tested, bureaucracies were strengthened, and diplomatic strategies evolved to account for a landscape in which enemies could quickly become allies and former allies could turn into threats. The empire had been humbled, yet it endured, proving that survival often demands not only strength, but the wisdom to learn from catastrophe. Adrianople became both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for adaptation, demonstrating the resilience of a civilization that refused to collapse entirely, even in the face of staggering losses. Myth and legend intertwined with history in the centuries that followed. Chroniclers framed the battle as a cosmic reckoning, a day when pride and hubris met the forces of destiny. Gothic narratives celebrated the cunning and courage of their ancestors, while Roman writers mourned the loss of command, discipline, and life. Adrianople, in this way, became more than a historical event. It became a symbol of human struggle, the interplay of order and chaos, the eternal tension between ambition and the unforeseen. It reminded all who heard the tale that history is shaped not only by the mighty, but by those who seize opportunity, adapt to circumstance, and confront the currents of fate with audacity. The battlefield itself, overgrown and silent, stands today as a testament to the impermanence of glory and the enduring consequences of decisive moments. The cries of the fallen have faded, but the story remains vivid, etched in chronicles, inscriptions, and the collective memory of civilizations. Scholars, historians, and storytellers return to Adrianople again and again, drawing lessons, reflections, and inspiration from the clash that forever altered the course of the Roman Empire. Its legacy is woven into the broader tapestry of human history, a reminder that every empire, no matter how mighty, is vulnerable to the forces of strategy, circumstance, and human determination. Ultimately, Adrianople was a mirror of the human condition, a convergence of ambition and error, of brilliance and hubris, of life and death. It illustrated the precariousness of power and the unpredictable currents that can transform destiny in an instant. The Goths' triumph was a testament to cunning and courage, a demonstration that skill and adaptability can overcome size and might. The Romans' defeat was a testament to the dangers of underestimation and rigid adherence to tradition, a stark reminder that even the greatest civilizations are subject to the relentless tests of history. As the sun sets over Thrace, casting long shadows across the quiet fields where armies once clashed, one is left to ponder the resonance of that day. Adrianople is more than a battle. It is a story of transformation, a lesson in resilience, and a symbol of the delicate balance between order and chaos. It is a reminder that history is never fixed, that empires rise and fall not only through force, but through the interplay of strategy, circumstance, and human choice. And in that reflection, one can see the eternal rhythm of civilization itself. A world shaped by courage and misjudgment, by ambition and adaptation, by moments of triumph and catastrophe that echo through time. In the end, Adrianople invites us to confront the complexities of history, to see beyond the surface of victories and defeats, and to understand the forces that shape human destiny. It reminds us that every battle, every decision, every act of courage or folly carries consequences far beyond the immediate, rippling through generations in ways that are often unpredictable and profound. The Battle of Adrianople. 378 CE stands as a testament to the eternal drama of human endeavor, a moment when the fate of empires hung in the balance, and the lessons of history were written in blood strategy and the enduring spirit of those who dared to shape their own destiny.